Okay, so this is where we left off with nervous system diseases. We left off with viral diseases. The first viral disease that we're going to talk about is polio. Polio was a much more common disease about 100 years ago. The last known case in the United States was in 1979, all due to vaccination. It's a cause of paralysis where the person who gets the disease will usually start off with numbness, and then they have to walk with crutches, and then they usually end up in a wheelchair. This is a little unusual if you read the second bullet here. The outbreaks in the late 1800s was actually attributed to improved sanitation, not worse sanitation. So basically what started happening with the Industrial Revolution is the environment started to be cleaned up more. People weren't leaving their trash just kind of everywhere. We started to have garbage collection. We started to have actual sanitation. We had, all kinds of ways of cleaning up the community. And it was actually because of that, the virus was not in the environment anymore. So people weren't just being exposed to the virus just by being out and about. So the only time they would get exposed to it would be through contact with another person. And since they had no natural immunity to it, since their body had never seen it before, that actually led to widespread outbreaks. And there was a lot of children in the early 1900s who got polio. And then, as they got older, the paralysis got worse and worse. So a lot of them during the 40s and 50s ended up in wheelchairs. I don't have the information in the PowerPoint regarding the vaccine, but I would like for you to read in your book on pages 618 and 619 the story about polio and about how the vaccine was discovered, and there was a little bit of drama involved with the polio vaccine, and I'd like you to all read about that in the textbook. Another viral disease of the nervous system is rabies. The word rabies is Latin for rage, so that kind of tells you a little bit about the disease, and we'll have more about it in the next couple slides. I just kind of lumped all of these together. The arthropod-borne encephalitis diseases, also known as arboviruses, these are a series of diseases that are viruses that are mostly vectored by the mosquito, and they do cause encephalitis. They do cause inflammation and infection of the brain. So some of the diseases are called Eastern and Western equine encephalitis, St. Louis disease, California encephalitis, and West Nile encephalitis, which most of you have probably heard of West Nile virus. So all of these diseases are spread by the mosquito, and oftentimes birds are reservoirs. So birds are not affected by these viruses, but mammals are. So some of these viruses, we will share them with dogs, cats, horses, pigs. They can get these viral diseases just like we can. And again, it's all spread by the mosquito. So more about rabies. Rabies carries an almost 100% fatality rate. It was several years ago the first case of someone with rabies who was actually saved through a lot of experimental treatments. It was a little girl who was bitten by a bat at her church, and unfortunately nobody did anything about it, and she actually came down with rabies, and obviously very dangerous disease. She was put into a medically induced coma, given all these different medicines and treatments, and eventually she did come out of it. She was cured, although she still had some brain damage and some lasting effects. The same protocol has been used a couple times to save a couple other people, but it's still a very high fatality rate. It's a small bullet-shaped RNA virus. The family name for rabies is Rhabdoviridae, and the genus name is Lissa virus. Many of the Lissa viruses are actually very dangerous. Rabies has a long incubation period, so you might actually not get symptoms for several weeks to a couple months after being exposed. It's often misdiagnosed as different brain issues, and it's not found in autopsy. The only way to know for sure that someone had rabies is to actually slice into their brain and find the little viral inclusions inside the brain tissue, and that's not a normal thing done at autopsy, so it would have to be a special procedure done on the body to check for rabies. Preliminary stages resemble flu-like symptoms, and then that progresses to things like agitation, muscle spasms, frothing of the mouth. Hydrophobia is a real thing with rabies, so it does mean fear of water. What happens in rabies is the virus does affect the brain, but it also is stored in the salivary glands. So it causes severe spasms of the throat muscles. So someone with rabies, when they see water, they actually get very, very uncomfortable because even the thought of drinking water makes them feel like they're going to drown or suffocate because their throat muscles are spasming and they're not able to control their ability to swallow. And that is how the disease is actually spread, is through biting, because the virus is found in the saliva. So when someone is bitten by something that has rabies, that's how you actually get the disease. And then the last symptom is paralysis, usually respiratory paralysis, and then death from there. The reason that rabies is such an incredibly rare disease in our country is because we vaccinate our pets. So every state has laws about dogs, cats, and ferrets all being vaccinated for rabies. And should an animal be suspected of having rabies, they are euthanized. So it's very important to have effective vaccine protocols. It's very important to have effective animal control in order to keep rabies at bay. Other parts of the world, they don't have these things in place. One example is in India, because it's against their religion to basically euthanize animals, and they don't have effective vaccination protocols in place, and there are rabid animals running around India potentially biting people. So when you travel to other parts of the world, it's important to kind of research any of these issues that could exist. If you are exposed to rabies, so if you are bitten by an animal, you can get prophylactic treatment. So they will give you injections. It's not exactly a vaccine, but it's injections to protect you from actually getting the disease itself. So this is a map of the different animals that are known to carry rabies. So in the United States, raccoons are number one. Anytime that you see a raccoon, a skunk, or a fox during the day, that is a very potential danger, because they are nocturnal animals and they're not supposed to be running around during the day. So if you do see a raccoon, a skunk, or a fox kind of staggering around during the day, it's very important to call animal control, and they should come out and get that animal, because it can be a very potential danger for you and for your pets. And then, of course, bats are well known for carrying rabies, but bats are immune to rabies. So bats will carry the disease, but they don't get sick the way that raccoons and skunks and foxes and these other animals will get sick from rabies and die. That doesn't happen to bats. So very important, if you have bats in your home or around your home, get them moved out of the area, because they could be potentially dangerous. So other diseases of the nervous system, Cryptococcus neoformans is a type of meningitis caused by a fungus. It's a fungus that lives in the soil, soil especially rich in pigeon droppings. So we've talked about this before, how bird poop is just a very, very rich source of all kinds of different diseases. All kinds of different pathogens live in bird droppings, and it can be, potentially very dangerous. This type of fungus can also infect the respiratory system, so it can cause a type of pneumonia as well as a type of meningitis. And many fungal diseases are especially dangerous for people that have AIDS, and this is one good example where Cryptococcus meningitis is one of the main killers of people that have AIDS. African sleeping sickness we've talked about before. This is a disease caused by a protozoan or a parasite Its name is Trypanosoma brucei. We wanted to look at this one in lab. This is the one we didn't have available, so you had to do this as a little homework for your lab report. So hopefully trypanosome, that sounds familiar. The protozoan is spread by the tsetse fly, so the tsetse fly is the vector. So when a tsetse fly bites somebody, they can transmit this parasite to them, and it is a very serious disease. It starts off with flu-like symptoms, and then it progresses to coma and death. And we have talked about how the trypanosome proteins are highly changeable, so they have that ability of antigenic variation. And then amoebic meningoencephalitis. This is encephalitis caused by an amoeba. You usually get this from swimming in warm, fresh water, so ponds, lakes, and streams. It is about 100% fatal, but also very rare. This was in the news somewhat recently. I think it was a European person was in Africa, and they were swimming in a lake. And if you breathe in the water through your nose, it can actually, the amoeba can get up inside your brain, and it basically feeds off of your brain and destroys the brain tissue. And then we have talked a little bit about mad cow disease and prions. So prions are infectious protein particles that cause what are called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. Mad cow disease is one of those. Sheep scrapie is essentially mad cow disease, but in sheep. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is essentially the same thing, but in humans. So there is a human version of mad cow disease. And again, it's called spongiform because it essentially turns the brain into a sponge. The brain looks like a sponge. It has all kinds of holes in it. And then another disease is called Kuru, which was discovered in isolated tribes in New Guinea. And the reason that they were getting the disease was due to their ritualistic cannibalism practices. So when someone would die, they would actually cut up the brain and eat it as part of a ceremony. And the people who were visiting them were trying to explain to them this was not good because they were just continuing the transmission of the disease through eating of the brain. So, a lot is not known about these prion diseases. They're relatively newer things. So maybe if you're still looking for a topic for your project, maybe kind of consider one of these. And then I just added in here chronic fatigue syndrome, which is idiopathic, cause unknown, possibly a link to genetics, viruses, possibly even Lyme disease. But I just wanted to include one last, little thing here that's kind of an unknown brain disorder that could potentially be linked to infectious agents. So that's it for chapter 22. Highly encourage you again to just kind of look through the book, especially that part on polio, because we didn't cover a lot about it. Certainly rabies and tetanus and botulism will be important topics for the test. And if you have any questions, as always, you can email me.